The atlas of negative space. The atlas was cheaper than a week of groceries because half of it was missing. That was how the dealer said it, as if hunger and scholarship belonged on the same ledger. He had a table near the back wall of the small book fair, 3 card tables pushed together and covered with grey felt that pilled under the weight of other people's wanting. Overhead, the fluorescent lights made every gilt title look like brass that had been handled too often. I had come for pamphlets and leftovers, things forgotten in boxes that other scholars didn't bother to open because the first layer didn't flatter them. He slid the volume toward me with 2 fingers, careful but not reverent. The binding had once been leather, the sort made to survive ship holds and damp parlors, but now it was the color of dried kelp and cracked in a pattern that looked like old riverbeds. Someone had attempted to repair the spine with thread that didn't match. The thread was modern, too white, too confident. "Fragment," he said. I nodded like I knew how to be prudent. He hadn't even needed to pitch it. The thing had weight, and weight is a kind of persuasion. When I opened it, the hinge sighed. The paper inside was thick and soft at the same time, as if it had learned to yield without tearing. Copperplate engravings, muted by time and by whatever hands had turned them before mine, lay in orderly spreads. C's cross-hatched with fine lines. Compass roses that looked like flowers designed by someone who disliked petals. Tiny ships etched in the margins. Decorations, yes, but also propaganda for the romance of commerce. And then the first wrongness, so clean I almost mistook it for simplicity. A coastline was gone. Not torn out, not smeared, not rubbed away by abrasion. Gone in the way a person can be missing from a family photograph because the negative was retouched before anyone made prints. The sea extended where land should have been, uninterrupted, as if the continent had never decided to intrude. It wasn't an obscure shore either, not a speculative outline from some fog-drenched rumor. It was a place the 18th century knew with the intimate certainty of profit, a familiar curve, a common harbor mouth, something any competent mapmaker of the period would have drawn without thinking, the way you write the letter E without inventing it each time. I turned the page, expecting the next plate to reassure me. The next plate betrayed me in a different direction. Another absence, another familiar edge erased. The blankness wasn't random. It had shape. It had intention. The dealer watched my face the way people watch weather. "Odd, isn't it?" "What do you know about it?" I asked. He gave a small shrug, the kind that keeps a person blameless. "Estate lot. Came with a trunk. Some plates missing entirely. Some, well, some like that." "Do you know the title?" I asked, flipping back to what should have been a title page, but was instead an end paper with a stain like a pressed thumb. "No title page," he said. "No publisher, no imprint. But the style's right. Late 18th, French or Dutch. Could be copied." "Copied?" I repeated, more sharply than I meant. The world is full of convincing counterfeits, and the maps are the easiest liars of all. They don't have to be accurate to be believed. They only have to be beautiful. He held up his hands as if my suspicion was smoke. "Paper's old, ink's old, could still be later, but it's honest in its damage." I should have walked away. I had rent. I had student loans that aged faster than I did. I had an appointment to teach a seminar that met in a windowless room and pretended to be a classroom. Instead, I asked him the price again. He named a number that was low enough to feel like a dare. When I paid, he wrapped the atlas in brown paper and twine. I carried it back to campus against my ribs, as if warmth could do anything for paper that had already endured 2 centuries of air. In my office, which was smaller than the catalogue room in our library and smelled faintly of the mildew no one admitted was there, I unwrapped the book and laid it on my desk. It looked out of place among my own belongings. Plastic folders, a chipped mug, the cheap stapler I'd bought because the department stapler had been stolen 3 years ago, and no one had filed the paperwork to replace it. I turned the pages slowly this time with the kind of attention that makes you aware of your own hands. The atlas was maritime, sea charts, port insets, compass bearings. There were latitude and longitude marks along the borders, neat as embroidery, soundings in tiny numbers in the shallows, shipping lanes suggested by dotted lines, like the ghost paths of things that didn't want to be seen from shore. But along certain coasts, the line that should have divided water from land simply stopped. It didn't wander or fade. It ended with the crispness of a choice. At first, I told myself the simplest story: a damaged plate, a poor re-inking, a printer's negligence. Copper plates wear down, lines break, apprentices make mistakes. I have spent enough time with old maps to accept that even masterpieces have days when the artist's hand slipped. Then I started listing the absences. Not the missing plates, the literal gaps where a page had been removed, the stubs still visible at the gutter. I listed the coastlines that were present as pages but absent as geography. I wrote down what I recognized: sections of the English Channel, portions of the Iberian coast, certain Caribbean islands that should have sat in their sea like coins but were simply not there. In one plate, a stretch of the West African coast was replaced by uninterrupted ocean and a polite field of stippling, like a patch of silence in the middle of an argument. The omissions were too specific to be the product of generalized decay. I pulled one of our department's reference atlases from the shelf and opened it beside the fragment. I compared the plate numbers, where they existed. I checked the decorative style. I studied the letter forms in the place names: the long S, the delicate flourish on capitals, the occasional misalignment where the engraver's burin had bitten too deep. Everything else was competent, sometimes brilliant. The seas were alive with texture, the hatches along the coasts were rendered with a hand that understood how land rises. The atlas knew its craft. Why, then, would it forget whole coasts? That question stayed with me through my seminar that afternoon. I watched my students argue about the politics of projection, Mercator and empire, Peters and rebuttal, and I kept seeing the blank places on my desk. Not ignorance, not censorship in the usual sense, the thick black bars of modern redaction that shout their existence. This was quieter, a map that hid by pretending there was nothing to hide. That night, after campus emptied and the library lights shifted into their late-hour dimness, I carried the atlas downstairs to special collections. The security guard recognized me, not by name but by the awkward way my bag always pulled on one shoulder. He waved me through with the weariness of someone who had long ago decided not to care about the difference between theft and curiosity. In special collections, the reading room smelled of climate control and old glue. The tables were broad and bare, designed to make you feel both safe and small. The curator on duty, a woman I'd spoken with exactly twice in 3 years, looked up from her computer. "You're late," she said. "I know." She glanced at the brown paper bundle. "New acquisition?" "New mistake," I said, and laid it gently on the table. She put on nitrile gloves with a snap that sounded like the closing of a pocket watch. "Where did you get it?" "A dealer at the fair." Her eyebrows rose, but she didn't comment. She unfolded the atlas with the suspicion of someone who has been burned by too many romantic scholars. I opened to one of the plates with an omission so blatant it made my stomach tighten. A harbor inset labeled with a familiar port name, complete with fortifications and depth markings, but with the coastline around it inexplicably absent. The port floated in open water like a stage set without a theater. She leaned closer. "That's peculiar. Do you think it's damaged?" She ran a gloved fingertip near the blank area without touching the ink. "If it were damage, you'd see disruption. Fibers pulled, abrasion, ink loss in adjacent areas. This is clean." "Censorship?" I offered, though the word felt wrong in my mouth. "Who would censor a coastline?" she asked, not as mockery but as genuine puzzlement. "And why only some?" I had no answer that fit inside the old stories we tell about maps, that they are tools of conquest, that they lie to flatter patrons, that they exaggerate and omit for power. Those stories are true, but they weren't this. She looked up at me. "You want to compare?" "Yes." She typed something and the printer in the corner exhaled a slip of paper. "Fill out the request. I'll bring out Bellin and Delisle." I should have been grateful. Instead, I felt a small private thrill, an indecent pleasure in the idea of setting this broken thing beside maps that were whole. When the comparative atlases arrived, they came like polite ghosts in grey cloth wraps. We opened them in parallel, plates spread like cards in a game no one admitted was gambling. Belen's coastlines were clear, Delisle's were confident. Even where knowledge was imperfect, the line existed. It tried. In my atlas, the line refused. I held the plates at the same angle, my eyes moving between them, seeking some correspondence in error, an identical gap, a shared hesitation. There was none. My atlas was unique in its silences. I photographed the problematic plates with the library's overhead camera, careful to follow protocol, careful to file the images where the university's servers could, in theory, preserve them long after my contract expired. Back in my office, I began the work that is both dull and intoxicating, overlaying. In the modern world, comparative cartography can be done with software. You scan, georeference, align control points. You make the past obedient to coordinates. It is an arrogant process, but it produces results that the naked eye can't. I spent hours placing control points on islands and capes that were drawn, anchoring my atlas to reality like a boat tied to a dock it did not recognize. Then I layered my scans over scans of contemporaneous charts pulled from digital repositories. I adjusted opacity until the two maps bled into each other. Where my atlas had nothing, the underlying map showed coast, and the emptiness itself began to look like an intentional mark. Because it wasn't that the mapmaker had failed to draw land. It was that he, or she, though the hand felt like a man trained in the guild's tradition, had drawn everything around the land with even greater care. Soundings stopped at the edge of the blankness, as if the sea itself respected it. Place names shifted, sometimes awkwardly, as if they had been relocated to avoid trespassing on the absent shore. Decorative cartouches curled near the void like plants leaning toward an opening in a wall. I printed the overlays and pinned them to my bulletin board. They looked like injuries. After a week, my list of omitted shores had become long enough to stop feeling like coincidence. Patterns appeared, not in geography but in commerce. The blank coasts clustered around specific kinds of ports, places known for insurance brokers, for commodity exchange, for the sort of shipping that could be measured in claims as easily as in cargo. They were not the largest harbors, not the most famous, but the ones that sat at the hinge points of trade routes, the in-between places where paperwork changed hands and a signature could turn water into money. That was the first time I thought the word insurance, not because I had any expertise in it. I knew the outline of maritime insurance history, the way risk moved from superstition to mathematics, how underwriters in coffeehouses turned shipwrecks into tables and premiums. I had read enough to make passing remarks in lectures, but the omissions made me think of risk the way insurance does. Not as what is present, but as what might happen where things fail. I went to the archives not for maps, but for ledgers. Our university held a small collection of shipping records from a defunct merchant house, donated decades ago by someone whose name was now on a scholarship. Most researchers ignored it. The handwriting was ugly. The entries were repetitive. The romance of sea voyages dies quickly when you're staring at columns of barrel counts. I asked for the boxes and received them with the kind of sigh librarians reserve for people who choose their own suffering. The ledgers were heavy, their pages warped from damp. Each entry was an attempt to make the sea predictable. Date, ship, captain, cargo, destination, expected arrival. Beside some entries were notes in a different hand, claims, losses, disputes. At first it was just reading, the slow translation of ink into meaning. Then a name caught my eye. It was the name of a port my atlas had erased. The ledger entry was banal, a shipment of sugar, a destination, a policy number. But beside it, in a cramped hand, someone had written a single word, void. I stared at it longer than the word deserved. In insurance, void is a verdict. It means the contract does not exist. It means the promised safety is withdrawn. In cartography, void is just sea. I turned pages faster. I stopped reading for narrative and started scanning for repetition. Ports I'd listed, policy numbers, peculiar marginal notes. The ledger began to show its own omissions. Entries scratched out, lines left blank, entire pages torn away with a violence that felt personal. By the end of the night, my notebook held a rough concordance between the atlas's absences and ledger entries marked with disputes, voids, and losses. I should have been satisfied. Correlation is the first drug of research. It gives you the illusion of momentum. Instead, I felt as if I had been handed a key without being told what door it opened. Over the next month, I built a table. Not a spreadsheet at first, paper, because paper makes you slower and slowness makes you less foolish. I wrote each omitted coastline as a row: location, plate number, approximate coordinates. Then, beside it, I added columns for archival references. Ledger mentions, known insurers operating in the region, notable shipwrecks in the period. The more I added, the more the absences seemed to be speaking to each other. Ports erased from the atlas matched ports associated with a particular cluster of underwriters whose names recurred in claims disputes. Not always the same underwriter, but the same circle, a network of names that appeared together like people who attended the same dinners. Some names were Dutch, some English, some French. They moved easily across borders, as money does when it is invited. I began to suspect that the atlas was not a navigational tool at all, but a record, an index of something someone wanted to remember without writing it down. That would explain the lack of title page and imprint. That would explain why the atlas was fragmented, why someone at some point had removed specific plates entirely, perhaps the most incriminating ones. That would explain the clean omissions. Blanks are easier to defend than marks. If caught, you can say the map is incomplete, that the engraver made a mistake, that the plate wore out. You can act offended that anyone would suggest intention. Silence is plausible deniability. I wanted a human voice from the past to anchor this. Maps, for all their authority, are faceless until you find the hand that made them. So I started looking for marginalia, not the neat labels etched into the plates, but the unauthorized marks left by later hands. Pencil ticks, ink smudges, notes in the gutter. People cannot resist leaving traces in books. Even the most careful owners leave behind the pressure of their habits. Under a raking light, I examined the blank coasts. At first I saw nothing. Then, in one void, so faint it could have been a flaw in paper, I found a cluster of tiny numbers written in brown ink. They were not coordinates. They were too irregular. They looked like amounts. I checked other blank areas, more numbers, not always, but enough. In one plate, the blank coast contained a single letter, an L, or perhaps a symbol that could be read as pounds if you were inclined to see currency everywhere. In another, there was a short phrase in French that I could barely make out: ne pas tracer, do not trace. My pulse quickened, not because I had uncovered a secret phrase, but because it was evidence of intent. Someone had treated the blankness as meaningful enough to warn against filling it in. I copied the notes carefully and photographed them with a macro lens. The ink was old, but not as old as the engraving. It had been added later, perhaps by the atlas's owner, or by someone in the same circle. The phrase sat in my mind like grit: do not trace. The next step, the one that made my work shift from academic to something closer to investigation, came because of a letter. It arrived on university letterhead, the kind of heavy paper administration uses to imply permanence. My name was typed correctly, which already felt like a small miracle. The letter informed me, politely, bureaucratically, that the Maritime Heritage Initiative had approved my application for a small research grant. I had, in fact, applied for such a grant months earlier, mostly out of desperation. Adjuncts learn to chase funding the way sailors learn to chase wind. The application had been generic. Digitization, preservation, public outreach, the usual promises of accessibility and impact. I had included a mention of my recent acquisition of an 18th century maritime atlas fragment, because grant panels like tangible objects. They like things that can be photographed. I had not expected anyone to care. The Maritime Heritage Initiative was funded by an endowment whose donors were not listed publicly. It dispensed small grants for historical preservation and maritime cultural revitalization. Mostly, it paid for interpretive signs, pier restorations, museum exhibits, the kind of work that makes donors feel like caretakers of history without requiring them to read any. My grant was modest, enough to cover a student assistant, some scanning time, perhaps travel to compare holdings in another archive. The letter included, at the bottom, an invitation. A board member wished to meet with me to discuss the broader significance of my atlas and explore potential partnerships. I read the letter twice. The second time, the words looked less like opportunity and more like attention. When you study maps long enough, you learn that attention is never neutral. Who looks at what and why matters. Maps are made by eyes with agendas. Still, I agreed to the meeting. I told myself it would be foolish to refuse. I told myself it was simply networking, the kind of professional upkeep everyone pretends not to hate. The board member met me at a cafe near campus that tried to look nautical without committing to any salt. There were framed photographs of ships on the walls, none of them local. The espresso machine hissed like a reprimand. He arrived precisely on time, which in my world of academic delays felt almost rude. He was middle-aged, well-dressed in a way that suggested he could afford to look casual. His hair was silver at the temples in a manner that looked curated. He introduced himself by first and last name. I won't write it here. It's not that I fear libel, it's that names in this story are too expensive to spend carelessly. He shook my hand with the confidence of someone who has never had to wonder whether his contract would be renewed. I hear you found something unusual, he said. I found something incomplete, I replied, because I hadn't yet decided how much to reveal. He smiled. Incompleteness can be the most valuable thing in an archive. The phrase was too perfect. It sounded rehearsed. It sounded like something he'd said before and enjoyed saying. I told him about the atlas in general terms. Maritime charts, fragmented plates, unknown provenance. I mentioned the missing coastlines as an oddity. He listened without interrupting, which in itself was a form of control. When I finished, he leaned forward slightly. And you believe the omissions are deliberate? I believe they're patterned, I said. He nodded, as if that were confirmation. Patterns tend to be deliberate. I watched his face. He wasn't startled. He wasn't amused. He didn't ask why a map would omit known shores. He accepted the premise as if he'd been waiting for it. That should have been my warning. Instead, it was my invitation deeper. What do you know about the atlas? I asked. He lifted his cup and set it down again carefully. Only that it has been circulating, private collections, rumors. It's the sort of thing people whisper about because they think whispering increases value. Why would people whisper about a damaged atlas? Because of what it might contain, he said, as if content and absence were the same. I forced myself to ask plainly, are you suggesting it's connected to something questionable? He smiled again, but this time the smile did not rise into his eyes. In maritime history, everything valuable is connected to something questionable. The sea is a corridor for both trade and theft. Our job, as stewards of history, is to preserve the artifacts, not to moralize them. Stewards, I repeated. He didn't seem to notice the skepticism in my voice. The initiative would like to support your work, more than a small grant. We have resources. We can help you exhibit the atlas, publish your findings, bring it to public attention. And in exchange? I asked. He looked mildly offended, as if I'd broken a social agreement by admitting the existence of exchange. In exchange, you would consult with us, keep us informed, ensure that whatever you publish is responsible. Responsible, I said. He leaned back. There are living communities around these ports. There are donors who care deeply about heritage. There are reputations tied to maritime philanthropy. It would be unfortunate if an enthusiastic academic framed a historical artifact in a way that suggested, how shall I put it, continuity of wrongdoing. My throat tightened. Do you think there is continuity? I think history is rarely as dead as we pretend, he said, and then his phone vibrated. He glanced at it, and the conversation shifted back into polite shapes. We discussed scanning standards, exhibition possibilities, the sort of details that can make a threat sound like collaboration. When we stood to leave, he placed a card in my hand. "Call me if you need anything." I watched him walk out into the street, absorbed into the city's everyday motion. I sat back down, not because I needed more coffee, but because I needed to feel the chair beneath me. The atlas sat in my office like a quiet animal. I began to look at it not just as an artifact, but as a lure. I made a decision that night that would later look, in hindsight, like either courage or stupidity. I did not tell the initiative what I found next. Instead, I widened my search beyond our university holdings. I requested reproductions of maritime insurance records from other archives. I visited a city library that held microfilm of 18th century shipping news, lists of departures and arrivals, rumors of wrecks, notices of salvage auctions. I read letters from merchants complaining about losses, begging underwriters for mercy. I read the language of risk as it hardened into formula, act of God, and perils of the sea, phrases that turned chaos into clauses. Slowly, a particular cluster of incidents emerged. Ships insured heavily by a certain group of underwriters suffered losses in suspiciously consistent ways. Not always total wrecks, partial cargo loss, fires that destroyed valuable goods while leaving the hull intact, storms that conveniently swallowed documentation. Claims were filed quickly. Disputes were resolved in ways that favored the same handful of merchants. It was not proof, it was pattern. The ports linked to these incidents were the ports my atlas had erased. I began to think of the atlas as a kind of negative index. Instead of marking safe harbors, it marked compromised ones. Instead of drawing attention, it avoided it. It was a map for people who already knew where to go, who needed only a reminder of where not to trust the visible world. A map for conspirators or a map for someone hunting them. That distinction mattered. If the atlas belonged to the criminals, the omissions were signals within a closed circle. If it belonged to an investigator, an adjuster, a clerk, someone tasked with tracking claims, then the omissions could be evidence encoded to survive. Either way, it was the kind of evidence that only worked if you knew how to read silence. I tried to find the atlas's origin by the only method that never fully fails: paper. I brought a handheld light to the reading room and examined the sheets for watermarks. In the blank margins, faint when viewed head-on but clear under light, I found the outline of a crowned shield, and beneath it a name in archaic script, a paper mill, a region. It placed the paper in the Low Countries, late 18th century likely, not definitive but enough to narrow the universe. I compared the watermark to catalogues. It matched a mill known to supply printers in Amsterdam and Rotterdam. The Dutch had been the accountants of the sea. It fit. And then, tucked into the gutter of one plate, as if someone had tried to hide it from casual eyes, I found a note in a different ink. La côte absente est la côte assurée. The absent coast is the insured coast. I translated it twice, hoping I'd misunderstood, but the phrase was blunt. Insurance was not just a theme, it was a key. From that point, my work acquired an urgency that did not come from ambition. It came from the sense that I was being watched by people who understood the map better than I did. There were small things at first. An email from the initiative, friendly, asking for an update. I replied with vague assurances. A staff member in Special Collections mentioning casually that someone had asked about an unusual maritime atlas and had been disappointed to learn it was in use. A misfiled box in the archives that contained the shipping ledger I'd been working with. It had been moved from the shelf to a cart and left there, as if someone wanted me to see that access could be interrupted. I kept working anyway, partly because I did not know how to stop. The more I traced the network in the 18th century, the more it began to resemble a modern one. Insurance fraud in that era depended on paperwork, on trust, on the slow movement of information. It required collaboration between merchants, underwriters, ship captains, port officials, people who could create plausible stories of loss and delay. Modern laundering depended on different tools: shell entities, non-profit grants, contractors. But it relied on the same principle, converting questionable money into legitimate narrative. And the Maritime Heritage Initiative was, at its surface, narrative, grants, preservation, culture, the language of virtue attached to the movement of funds. So I did something I had always told my students to do with maps. I looked at the margins. I pulled the initiative's publicly available documents, annual reports, glossy brochures, grant lists. The language was thick with care. Revitalization, stewardship, legacy. But the lists of grant recipients were specific enough to be useful. I printed them and laid them beside my list of omitted ports. The overlap was immediate and unsettling. A pier restoration in a small harbor my atlas had erased. A museum exhibit in a coastal town absent from one plate. A preservation grant for a lighthouse on an island that in my atlas did not exist. The initiative, which purported to fund maritime heritage broadly, was disproportionately investing in sites connected to the atlas's silences. Again, not proof, pattern. I began to see the initiative not as a benign foundation, but as a descendant organism, feeding on the same geography the old fraud network had marked. The old network had moved money by exploiting risk. The new one moved money by exploiting virtue. Both depended on the public believing the story they were told. My first instinct was to publish. Scholars are trained to respond to discovery with disclosure, as if transparency alone has moral force. I imagined an article, careful, footnoted, restrained, about negative evidence in 18th century maritime cartography. I imagined colleagues nodding at conferences, impressed by my ingenuity. I imagined tenure committees, though I was not even on a tenure track, suddenly recognizing my worth. Then I thought of the board members' warning, framed as responsibility, and I understood that publication would not be a neutral act. It would be interpreted not as scholarship, but as accusation. Accusation invites retaliation. Still, I could not accept the alternative. Silence. So I chose a third path, one that seemed clever at the time and now feels like a confession of my own naivety. I decided to visit one of the omitted ports. I chose a town that was small enough to be manageable and significant enough to matter, a place with an 18th century merchant history and a modern preservation project funded by the initiative. The atlas had erased its shoreline cleanly, leaving only the name of the port floating in a field of sea. I told no one at the initiative. I told the library curator only that I needed to see local archives. I traveled by train, watching the inland landscape slide past, thinking about how maps flatten distance until travel restores its stubbornness. At the station, I rented a car and drove toward the coast. The town was not picturesque in the way brochures promise. It was working, worn. Fishing boats sat in the harbor like tired animals. The air smelled of diesel and kelp. The sea was the color of dull metal. The preservation project was obvious. A renovated warehouse near the docks had been turned into a maritime heritage center. New signage, clean glass, interpretive panels. A plaque near the entrance listed donors, including the Maritime Heritage Initiative in letters large enough to be grateful. Inside, the exhibits were earnest. Model ships, old nets, a recreated merchant's desk with quills and ledgers, a timeline of the town's golden age of trade, carefully avoiding mention of what trade meant in that era, carefully framing everything as commerce rather than exploitation. A volunteer at the front desk handed me a brochure. "If you want the archives, it's upstairs," she said, as if people came here for archives. Upstairs, in a room that smelled of paper and new paint, a local archivist sat behind a desk. She looked up as I entered, her expression cautious but not unkind. "I'm here to see your historical shipping records," I said, and gave my university affiliation. Her posture softened slightly. "We don't get many researchers." "I'm studying an 18th century atlas that omits this coastline," I said, because honesty in my mind was still a kind of protection. Her eyebrows lifted. "Omits it how?" I described the blankness. She laughed once, not amused but startled. "That's a strange way to mark a place." "Unless you want the place to be seen only by those who already know it exists," I said. She studied me for a moment. "Are you looking for smugglers?" I'm looking for underwriters, I said. The word seemed to unsettle her. She nodded and stood. Come with me. She led me to a locked cabinet and pulled out a ledger wrapped in cloth. When she opened it, the pages were filled with entries in tight handwriting, the ink browned with age. It was the town's harbour book. Records of ships entering and leaving, fees paid, cargo declared. I flipped through, careful, searching for the dates that aligned with the Atlas's probable production. Then I found it. A series of entries for ships insured by a particular firm whose name I had seen in my other documents. Beside one entry, in a different hand, someone had drawn a small mark in the margin, a blank square. Not a letter, not a symbol of any common accounting practice I knew, just a square, empty. It was, in miniature, the same gesture as the Atlas's blank coast. My skin prickled. Do you know what that mark means? I asked. The archivist leaned over my shoulder, her breath smelling faintly of tea. We've never interpreted it. It shows up now and then. People assume it's a clerk's habit. How many times does it appear? She looked at me, and I saw something shift behind her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or wariness. It appears more often in certain years. Years with unusual losses, I asked. Her mouth tightened. You should be careful. That was the first overt warning I'd received that did not come wrapped in institutional politeness. Why? I asked. She hesitated, then said quietly, This heritage center, this whole project, was funded by people who like to control the story. They call it preservation. Sometimes it feels like editing. Editing, I repeated. She nodded. We had an exhibit draft once that mentioned a shipwreck that wasn't heroic. It was suspicious. The donors asked us to remove it. They said it wasn't in the spirit of the center. Did you remove it? Her gaze held mine. We did. We have staff. We have bills. We're a coastal town. We don't get to be proud in expensive ways. I looked back down at the ledger, at the empty square mark. Silence had always been an instrument of power. In that moment, I felt its weight with a clarity that made me nauseous. I spent the rest of the day in the archives, photographing entries, copying names, tracing connections. The archivist stayed near, occasionally pointing me toward relevant volumes, occasionally stepping out of the room to answer the phone. Each time she left, I became aware of how alone I was with the records. That night, in my hotel room overlooking the harbor, I laid my notes on the bedspread. The town's lights reflected on the water like coins scattered by a careless hand. I tried to assemble the evidence into something coherent, a story of 18th century fraud, encoded in an atlas through a mission, a modern foundation funding preservation projects in the same ports, a pattern that suggested money moving through history like a current. And beneath it all, the sense that the atlas was not merely recording crime, but participating in it, either as tool or trap. I slept poorly. In the morning, I returned to the Heritage Center to say goodbye to the archivist and to request copies of certain documents through proper channels. She met me at the desk with a folder already prepared, her efficiency almost aggressive. I printed what I could, she said, sliding it to me. Some things you'll have to request formally. Thank you, I said. She hesitated, then asked, Have you told the initiative you're here? No. Her relief was brief. They'll know anyway. How? She didn't answer directly. Our director has to report visits from researchers. It's part of the grant requirements. They want impact metrics. Impact metrics, I thought, a modern way of saying surveillance. As I left the building, I noticed a man leaning against the railing outside, looking at his phone. He wore a windbreaker and had the posture of someone waiting without appearing to wait. He glanced up as I passed, his eyes sliding over me with a kind of practiced neutrality. He did not speak, he did not follow, but my body remembered him long after I'd driven away, the way a coastline remembers erosion. Back on campus, the world resumed its ordinary shape. My students complained about deadlines. My department chair forgot my name in a faculty meeting. The library's heating system clanked. Life continued in its small, indifferent motions. The atlas, however, felt different in my hands. I began to see the omissions not just as marks, but as doors, openings into a hidden infrastructure of trust and betrayal. I reconstructed more coastlines digitally, filling in the blanks based on contemporary maps. Each time I traced a missing shore, I felt as if I were committing a transgression. "Do not trace," the marginal note had said, and here I was, tracing. But I needed to see what the whole pattern looked like when the blanks were filled. When I overlaid my reconstruction of all omitted coasts onto a modern map, something unexpected emerged. The omitted ports, linked by maritime routes, formed a network that resembled a diagram more than a geography. It looked like a set of nodes connected by flows. It looked, in other words, like finance. I stared at the screen, aware that my brain was searching for meaning, perhaps imposing it. Humans are pattern-making machines. We find faces in clouds. We find conspiracy in coincidence. Yet the resemblance was too strong to dismiss. The old network of ports mirrored, in its structure, the modern network of grant recipients and contractors I had begun to map from public filings. The same shape, 2 centuries apart, continuity. I decided finally that I could not keep the work in my office, subject to accidental disappearance. I needed redundancy. I needed someone else to know. So I contacted a colleague at another institution, someone whose expertise in maritime legal history exceeded mine, someone I trusted not to laugh. I sent her a carefully phrased email. I had found an atlas with deliberate omissions. I suspected a connection to 18th century insurance fraud. I had patterns to show. She replied within an hour, "This is extraordinary. Can you share scans?" I hesitated over the attachment icon as if it were a trap. Then I attached 3 plates and sent them. 2 days later, her email arrived. It was short. "Do not send more. Call me," I called. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was lower than usual. "Where did you get this?" I told her. "Do you know what you have?" she asked. "I know what I think I have." "No," she said. "You have something that has already been weaponized." I sat down hard in my office chair. "What do you mean?" She exhaled. "There's an old case, more rumor than case, about an insurance consortium in the late 18th century. People called it the Silent Shore. It's not in the official records because the official records were managed." "Managed how?" "By absence," she said. "Documents missing, names omitted, ports unmentioned, ships that vanish from registers. When people tried to investigate, their careers ended. Their papers disappeared. Their reputations dissolved." "That sounds like folklore," I said, though my own voice had gone thin. "Folklore survives when evidence doesn't," she replied. "And your atlas looks like the kind of thing that created the folklore in the first place." I swallowed. "Do you think the initiative is connected?" There was a pause long enough to feel deliberate. "What is the initiative's full name?" I told her. She made a sound that was almost a laugh, but not. "Of course." "What?" I demanded. "That name shows up in a modern context," she said carefully. "Not in the way you want. Not in a way you can footnote." I waited, my hand gripping the edge of my desk hard enough to whiten my knuckles. "I've done consulting work for law firms," she said. "Occasionally they run background checks for non-profit fraud. There are patterns. Preservation grants are a known laundering channel because they come with public goodwill and complicated accounting. No one wants to be the person who audits a museum." "So what do I do?" I asked. Another pause. "You decide whether you want to be right or safe." I hated her for that sentence, even though it was honest. I wanted a third option that didn't involve surrender. After we hung up, I sat staring at the atlas. The blank coasts looked suddenly like mouths held shut. I still had the grant money. I still had the initiative's letter. I still had the board member's card in my wallet like a splinter. The sensible thing would have been to pivot my research into something bland, write about the aesthetics of omission, theorize negative space as artistic choice, avoid naming any ports or underwriters. Publish safely. Keep my job. But the atlas had already changed my vision. It had made me sensitive to absence in a way that was no longer academic. I began to see omissions everywhere, in funding reports, in exhibit labels, in the way certain historical narratives were polished smooth while others were left rough and unvisited. Silence was not the absence of sound. It was a crafted space. I thought of the local archivist in the coastal town removing a suspicious shipwreck from an exhibit because donors asked. Preservation as editing, heritage as laundering. My anger at first was abstract. Then it became personal, because the initiative emailed again, asking for an update, and this time the tone was slightly different, still polite, but with an edge of expectation. I replied with a general summary and mentioned I had visited a relevant port archive. I did not name the town. 2 hours later, my phone rang. The board member. "I hear you've been traveling," he said. "How did you—" "I'm glad you're being proactive," he continued smoothly. "We value initiative." The word initiative sounded in his mouth like a joke only he understood. "I'm doing research," I said. "Of course, we're simply eager to support you. Perhaps we should schedule another meeting. There are sensitivities." I felt the room tighten around me. "What sensitivities?" He did not answer directly. "The public loves stories of maritime heroism. They respond well to narratives of endurance, community, resilience. They do not respond well to insinuations of criminal lineage. It can harm living communities." "Is it an insinuation if it's documented?" I asked. A brief silence. Then gently, "Documentation is a matter of what survives." The threat was not in his tone. It was in his certainty. After we hung up, I checked my email. A new message from the university's IT department informed me that my storage quota had been exceeded and that files might be deleted if I did not clear space. The timing felt too neat. I hurried to the server and downloaded my atlas scans to an external drive. Then I copied them again to another drive. Then I printed key plates on paper, because paper cannot be remotely erased. That night I went to Special Collections to look at the atlas again, to reassure myself it was still there. I had not yet officially donated it, but I had been leaving it in their secured cabinet because my office lock was a joke. The curator on duty looked up as I entered. "You're back." "I need the atlas," I said. She hesitated. "It's not in the cabinet." My breath stopped. "What do you mean?" I asked. "It was checked out," she said. "By whom?" She glanced at her computer screen. Her face tightened. "There's a request form. It's internal." "Internal to who?" She looked at me with sympathy I hadn't earned. "There was an administrative request. For an audit of acquisitions. They needed to verify holdings." "Who requested it?" I demanded. She shook her head slightly. "I'm not supposed to—" "Please," I said, and heard, to my own disgust, the strain in my voice. She typed something, then slid her screen slightly so I could see. A name in the request field. It was the board member's last name. My body went cold in a way that felt chemical. I knew suddenly, with a clarity that did not require evidence, that this was not about heritage. This was about control. I left the library without the atlas. Outside, the campus air was damp and smelled of cut grass. Students walked past me laughing. Their world was intact. Mine had acquired a hole. I did what scholars do when power moves against them. I tried to move evidence out of reach. I contacted my colleague again and told her the atlas had been taken from Special Collections under an administrative request. I offered to send all my scans. She replied, "Do not email, use courier, no names." Her fear infected me. I packed the external drives in a padded envelope and mailed them to her address without return information. Then I began writing. Not an academic article, not yet. A narrative, a record of what I had found, how I had found it, who had approached me. I wrote like someone leaving notes in a bottle. I thought briefly of going to law enforcement. But what would I tell them? That an old atlas had missing coastlines and a non-profit foundation was behaving oddly. That I suspected laundering through preservation grants? Without subpoenas, without accounting access, I had only patterns, and patterns are easy to dismiss when they threaten donors. So I wrote for the only audience I could reliably reach: the future. The next week, things began to vanish. At first, it was trivial. My campus ID stopped working at the building's door. The receptionist looked at me as if I were a stranger and asked who I was here to see. When I said my own name, she frowned. "Are you a student?" "I teach here," I said. She checked a list, then shook her head. "I don't see you." I assumed it was an administrative error. Universities are factories of error. I went to human resources to resolve it. HR told me my contract had ended. "It ends in May," I said, and showed them the email confirming my renewal. The woman behind the desk looked at her screen. "There's no record of that." I felt sweat gather at the back of my neck. "Check again." She gave me a look that combined pity and irritation. "I'm sorry. There's nothing in the system." I left HR with a printed sheet that said I was not employed. Outside, the day was bright in a way that felt wrong. I sat on a bench and stared at the paper. My name was not on it. It was a generic statement. No contract, no signature, no trace. I called my department chair, voicemail. I emailed. The message bounced back, address not found. I walked to the department office. My nameplate was gone from the adjunct mailbox row. My office key still worked, but the name card on the door had been replaced with blank plastic. Inside, my books were as I'd left them. My mug, my stapler, but the computer had been wiped. The desktop background was the university logo, fresh and impersonal, as if the machine had never belonged to anyone. In that moment, a memory surfaced uninvited. The Atlas's blank coastline, the way it made land disappear without damage. Documentation is a matter of what survives. I went to the library to find the curator, to demand the return of the Atlas, to demand that someone acknowledge reality. The security guard at the entrance stopped me. "You need your card," he said. "I'm faculty," I replied, and held up my ID. He scanned it. The scanner beeped red. "Expired," he said, and handed it back. "It was working last week." He shrugged. "Not my problem." I tried to argue. He looked past me, bored. Behind him, students flowed in and out like water through a harbor mouth. I stepped away, my heart pounding not with fear, but with a cold, stunned disbelief. The world had not changed. The world had simply omitted me. I walked to my bank. At the teller window, I gave my account number. The teller typed, frowned, typed again. "I'm sorry," she said. "I can't access this account." "Why?" "It appears to be closed." "That's impossible." She looked at me with the practiced caution of someone trained to see fraud everywhere. "Do you have identification?" I showed her my driver's license. She compared it to her screen, then shook her head. "This identification doesn't match any records associated with the account." I felt my voice rise. "It's my account." She glanced at her supervisor. The supervisor came over. His tone was calm, and that calmness made me want to break something. "Sir." "I'm not a sir," I said automatically, then stopped. The gender misread didn't matter. The misrecognition did. "I'm sorry," the supervisor said, adjusting smoothly. "We can't assist without proper documentation." I left the bank with my hands shaking. On the sidewalk, I stood still, watching people move around me. A woman pushed a stroller. A man talked into a phone. A cyclist swerved to avoid a pothole. The city performed its normal indifference. I thought of the old underwriters and their coffee houses, the way they had turned human loss into numbers, and then, when necessary, turned numbers into nothing. I had believed foolishly that evidence could protect me, that documenting a pattern would make it real enough to defend. But omission is not just a tactic on paper. In the modern world, it is infrastructure. If your name is removed from databases, you become unbanked, unemployed, uncredentialed, not dead, but unrecognized. A person-shaped blank on the coastline of society. The next day, my landlord called. "Your rent payment didn't go through," she said. "I know," I replied. "My bank account—" She cut me off. "And the background check we ran when you moved in, it's coming back strange. Like the social security number doesn't exist." I stared at the wall, at a small water stain shaped vaguely like a continent. "That's not possible." "It's what the system says," she said. "I need you to sort it out." After the call, I sat on the floor of my apartment and tried to remember every form I'd ever filled out, every place my name had been recorded. I thought of the ledger entries scratched out, the torn pages, The way history can be edited by removing the line that makes land land. A week passed, then another. Each day, another small erasure. My email address stopped working. My phone service was interrupted. The utilities sent notices to occupant, as if my name had never been on the account. Friends, real friends, people I'd known for years, responded to my messages with confusion. One of them, when I showed up at her door, looked at me with a frown that was almost anger. "Who are you?" We had eaten dinner together the month before. We had argued about film endings and laughed over burnt rice. Now her eyes slid over me without catching. It would have been easier if she had been pretending, but her confusion looked genuine. That was when I understood the full cruelty of omission. It doesn't have to kill you. It can simply remove the bridge between you and everyone else. In the second month, I received a package. No return address, brown paper, twine. For a moment, my breath stopped. The parcel on my table looked like the atlas had the day I bought it, as if time was circling. I untied it carefully. Inside was a folder, thick with paper. At the top was a letter typed, "No signature. You have been studying the wrong coastline." Beneath the letter were photocopies, grant documents, contractor invoices, internal initiative communications. The kind of paperwork that only exists inside systems I no longer had access to. Someone had sent me evidence. Someone inside the network, or someone inside my university, had decided that my erasure did not have to be total. I flipped through the pages, my hands steadying as my mind found its old habit, reading for pattern. The documents showed money moving from the initiative to preservation projects, then to contractors, then to consulting firms, then, through a series of transfers and subcontracts, back to entities linked to the initiative's board. It was laundering, but not in a simple circle. It was laundering through narrative, every transfer accompanied by a report, an exhibit, a community impact statement, virtue as invoice. And then in the middle of the stack, a document that made me laugh once, sharply, like a cough. An old insurance policy, reproduced from an 18th century archive, attached as historical context for a grant proposal. The policy insured a ship. The ship's name was my name, not metaphorically, not approximately, exactly. The handwriting was clear. The underwriter's signature was there. The policy number matched one of the numbers I had found scribbled in the blank coast of the atlas. I sat down hard, the paper trembling in my hands. It didn't make sense, not in the way that makes the world orderly. Ships are named many things. It could be coincidence, a common name, a shared word. Except my name, which now could not be found in modern systems, was not common. It was the kind of name given to people through family stories, not the kind of name slapped on a hull. I looked again. The name was followed by a note, registered as person. I read it twice, my mind tripping. Registered as person. In the 18th century, ships could be treated as legal persons for certain purposes, entities that could hold obligation, incur debt, be insured. It was a fiction that made commerce smoother. A legal fiction. My stomach turned as my mind, unwilling, began to connect. If my name existed first as a ship, an insured vessel tied to a fraud network, then perhaps my modern identity had been built on that fiction. Perhaps my social security number, my bank account, my employment, had all been layered onto a name that was, at its origin, an instrument. An entity that could carry money, a vessel. I thought of the atlas again. The absent coast is the insured coast. The insured coast is the absent coast. Risk marked by silence. I had believed I was uncovering a crime. I had not considered that I might be part of its infrastructure. The letter at the top of the package had said I was studying the wrong coastline. I understood then what that meant. I'd been looking outward, at ports, at harbors, at geography, but the coastline that mattered was the one around my own existence, the border between person and paperwork. Someone had erased me not as punishment for my research, but as routine maintenance. As if the system had decided, with the same crispness as the atlas's omissions, that my line no longer needed to be drawn. And yet, someone had sent me this package. Someone wanted me to see. I sat there for a long time listening to the refrigerator hum, the building creak. Outside, cars passed. The world continued. I opened my notebook, the one I had been writing my record in, the one paper thing that still belonged to me in a world that was turning digital blanks into exile. I began to write again, but not as a scholar chasing tenure, not as a detective chasing proof, as a vessel writing its own manifest. I wrote the names of ports I had found erased. I wrote the names of underwriters. I wrote the initiative's grant recipients. I wrote in careful print the policy number on the old insurance document, because numbers are harder to argue with than names, and because numbers, like coastlines, are drawn or not drawn by people with power. In the next pages, I wrote something I had avoided until then, my own name, over and over, as if repetition could keep it from disappearing. Then I stopped. Not because I was finished, but because I realized what the Atlas had been teaching me from the beginning. If you want something to survive, sometimes you don't write it where the people in power can erase it. You write around it. You leave it in negative space, in omissions that become visible only when someone compares, reconstructs, refuses to accept the official shoreline. So I tore a page from my notebook and wrote a single sentence on it. The coastline you're looking for is missing on purpose. I folded it small and slipped it into the hollow of the Atlas's binding, into the place where the spine had cracked and been stitched with too white thread. The Atlas, which I no longer had, lived now only in my scans and in the memory of my hands. But the gesture mattered. The act of hiding meaning inside a gap mattered. Then I did something that felt both ridiculous and necessary. I walked to the coast, not to the port town I had visited, not to any historically significant harbor, but to the nearest stretch of shore I could reach by bus. It was not a place of ships and commerce. It was a small public beach with a worn boardwalk and a snack stand that smelled of frying oil. The sea was cold, grey, indifferent. I stood at the edge where water met land and watched the line shift with each wave. Coastlines are not stable. Maps pretend they are. Insurance policies pretend they are, but the shore is always negotiating. I thought of the Atlas's blank coasts and understood with sudden clarity that they were not just signals of crime. They were a philosophy. Control the border, and you control what can be claimed. The waves erased footprints as soon as they were made. The sand kept no ledger. I took out a pen and, on the back of the initiative's grant letter, the one printed on heavy paper meant to imply permanence, I drew a coastline. Not any real coastline. A simple curve, a harbor mouth, a line that could belong anywhere. Then, in the middle of it, I stopped drawing and left a gap. A deliberate blank. I folded the paper and let it fall into the shallow water. It floated for a moment, then sank, and the sea took it without comment. The unusual thing, the thing I did not expect, the thing that made my breath catch, was that as the paper disappeared, a child nearby pointed at the water and said, not to me but to the air, "Look, it's gone." Her mother glanced up, distracted, and said, "It was never there." The child insisted, "It was." The mother shook her head, already moving away. "No, come on." I stood frozen, watching them walk up the beach, their conversations swallowed by wind. It was a small exchange, a child's stubbornness, a parent's dismissal. But it landed in me like a verdict, because that was the argument the Atlas had been making all along. That was the argument the initiative had been funding. That was the argument that had now been applied to my own existence. It was never there. I turned away from the water and walked back toward the bus stop, my pockets light, my identity lighter. In my apartment that night, I opened my laptop out of habit, though it no longer recognized me. The login screen waited with blank politeness. I stared at it for a long time, then closed it. I pulled out a sheet of paper and began writing this account by hand, not because I believed paper was safer, but because paper is honest about its fragility. It can burn, it can tear, it can be lost. But when it exists without asking a database for permission. I wrote until my hand cramped. I wrote about the Atlas and its blank coasts. I wrote about the ledgers and the empty squares in the margins. I wrote about the board members' smile, about the Heritage Center's polished exhibits, about the way donors prefer history that behaves. I wrote about how omission can be a code and a weapon, how silence can be used to move money and to move people out of the world. And when I reached the part where I should write the final proof, the name that ties the initiative's modern accounts to the old underwriters, the detail that would make this something more than pattern, I stopped. Not because I lacked it. I have it. It sits in my head like a stone. I stopped because I finally understood the Atlas's last lesson. If I write that name here plainly, it becomes a coastline they can erase, a line they can delete from the record. If I leave it out, if I build the story around its absence, then the absence itself becomes the signal. Someone, someday, will compare what I have written with what is publicly available. They will notice the gap. They will trace around it. They will reconstruct what I cannot safely draw. They will understand that the most important shore is the one that is missing. So I will end the way the Atlas ended its most dangerous plates, with the sea continuing where land should be, with the blankness shaped like intent, with the evidence held in what is not drawn, and with the name left where it belongs, in negative space.